we think about this home office nook, the work from home lounges and stuff like that, do you think that's here to stay?
I think it is here to stay in some form. I do think that people have a desire to be around other people. The numbers aren't ticking as much month to month as maybe people would expect as people like Amazon go back to the office. But I do think that more and more companies will realize that they're losing some of the softer skills and the non-quantifiable things as they get through a couple cycles of employees that you can't train and you can't bring up your talent the same way through a screen.
On this episode, I'm speaking with Jeff Hreben, Senior Development Manager of Chicago-based Tandem. Within Tandem's entrepreneurial environment, he's been responsible for leading market intelligence research and providing direction on programming, financial feasibility, investor relations, site selection, and more. With a master's in city planning from the University of Penn and a certificate of real estate development from the Wharton School of Business, Jeff prides himself on bringing a balanced dose of technical knowledge with creative design thinking. This was a really fun one with Jeff where we covered a lot of development topics, so let's jump right in. All right, Jeff, thank you for joining me on the Transforming Cities today. It's great to see you.
How's it going? Good to see you, Chris.
So you have listened to Transforming Cities a bit over time, which I love that you are a fan. That's now become a guest. It's the best way to do it. And it was great to get to know you in late 2024 a little bit more, learn more about the projects you and the crew are involved with. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I always like to talk about young Jeff, the early years. So set the stage, a little bit about your upbringing and early experiences.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Chris. Great to talk here today. Excited to jump in. Come from Phoenix, Arizona, so I grew up in the suburbs of the desert, which is very foreign from my day-to-day in Chicago and Florida these days. Grew up in kind of the typical middle-class suburban family. Parents were divorced, but lived the kind of world where you drive into a garage and you leave the next morning out the same way you came, with not a lot of sort of interaction with your neighbors. So that sort of formulated a little bit of my upbringing. Went to college in Chicago, which is what brought me out here to the Midwest. Ties to the Midwest in Minnesota and Ohio, so it's kind of been ingrained in me and really aligned on that when I went out to the University of Chicago for undergrad. And that sort of set me on the trajectory of where I spend my time today in my role at Tandem. Happy to go into it a little bit more if there's other areas that you want me to sort of touch on there. Yeah.
One of the things that we briefly talked about prior was this idea of excellence. And it's something that stuck out to me as being very unique to you, to Jeff. And you told me that in terms of excellence, academics was always a thing that you tended to sort of gravitate towards. Talk to me about what that really meant for you and what that looked like growing up.
Yeah, I had a type A sort of achieving mother that instilled in me not pressure, but a importance on education and creating something better than what came before, and that idea of excellence and doing your best. And that doesn't always mean being the best, but doing what comes naturally to you. And that sort of bred and instilled in me a desire to achieve in the classroom, and kind of went above and beyond in all of the sort of book-learned subjects that you might have in high school. That I spent a lot of time in the International Baccalaureate program, which sort of exposed me to a lot of different types of people and viewpoints in a way that you don't always get in that suburban environment where there's 700 kind of typical suburban high school students. The sort of smaller International Baccalaureate really opened up my eyes. The real world was. Even if you didn't get it driving to and from the normal high school there. So that my mom kind of asked me and had me stretch myself to go off and not spend college in Arizona and figure out what else is the world in college. And to do that, I sort of had to prove myself in the classroom, and that finds its way through a lot of ways that work here and today, and that took to my career in development. Using data and figuring out how to reconcile historic precedent, which I didn't necessarily understand, might be part of my day-to-day job when I'm talking about World War II or the ancient ages, but it kind of, in some ways, parlayed through even today.
Well, let's stick to the work ethic piece of that quickly, because
Sure.
you said something to me about you first started working around the age of 13 or 14,
Yeah.
and that was similar to me, and I feel like what I experienced with those early life lessons is that there's a lot to learn outside of our little ecosystems at that age.
Yeah.
What were some of your early jobs? For me, it was like bag boy, grocery store guy, stuff like that, where I'm like interacting with people in a way that I don't necessarily, air quote, want to be doing, but it's a job. It gave me a little money in the pocket. What were those first jobs for you?
Yeah, no, and this kind of goes back to my mom and what her career was. She would help facilitate a lot of different executive events in her role in her company, and I ended up working for a dinner theater as a busboy, working late hours when I was 13, 14, that she had kind of facilitated with one of the banquet managers there, and I would work in high school and middle school up until the end of the day, and then go to the dinner theater and stay up until 1, 2 in the morning, sometimes on the weekends. That bred that kind of work ethic as well as excellence, if you will. And then I also worked in a retail store in high school, being a sales associate, minimum wage, hanging out with your friends, but kind of learning what it means to interact with people in that transactional manner was part of my early jobs as well. And I always say that everyone should work in retail and food and bev at least once in their lives to understand what it takes to make this whole world work. It's such a big part of our daily lives that not knowing that other side, I think it really hinders people. Yeah, I started working very early, and I think that has been a great thing to have experienced before getting out into the real world, to have it in little chunks rather than being thrust into a world where you're working 40 hours a week in the desk job.
That's right. Yeah, we had I think we had a pretty fun laugh around, because I worked at PacSun for a while, like over Christmas breaks and stuff, when I would be around, and the summer job wasn't necessarily in full swing, and I definitely remember those days of folding clothes, dealing with finding sizes, and whatever else comes up in those jobs.
Yeah, and feeling out people trying to write fake checks and bring fake credit cards, and you get a sense of like what your intuition is there.
Exactly.
Yeah, was front and center for many years, and I actually keep in touch with some of those people.
Well, let's pivot and start learning a little bit more about your journey into the development world. Obviously, there's a lot to dig into with that. This question usually goes one of two ways with guests on the show, and I'm always curious, where did that begin? Because I'm curious if it was like the mindset heading into college career and post-college career, or did you just sort of float and find your way into this world? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, it definitely was not a trajectory that I was on going into college. I had been around the International Baccalaureate program, and my mom worked in the legal world in corporate America, and I thought I wanted to be an international corporate lawyer, which sounds probably pretty dry at this point, given the cool things that we get to do here at Tandem now. But that was where I thought I was going when I went to college. As I finished that sort of 4-year excursion, I was either going to be going in the consulting world or some offshoot of that, which people typically do with sort of the international studies and econ program that I studied in. But I wanted to help coach the crew team afterwards, and I actually went into organization within the university in the admissions office and worked in database management and admissions. And that's kind of what gave me the time to figure out how I wanted to parlay into the real estate world, because I wouldn't have been able to put my finger on it in college or even right after it. But the time in the big city, I mean, I'm looking out my office window here and I can see the Willis Tower And I can kind of see the people that are actually on the street here, where that wasn't part of my daily experience for the first 18 years. And feeling that vibrancy in college and those first couple years afterwards really started to foment an idea that, hey, there's something to this building of places, and started to kind of read blogs. And there used to be a very popular, and it's kind of morphed into other media realms now, but it was called Curbed. And just sort of seeing all of the development that was happening in that kind of, call it 2003 to 2009, and just the number of projects and the high rises that were happening. I was a junkie on those boards. I mean, I would read every word and I'd read all the comments, and sort of being engaged in that community of builders and interested citizens really kind of got me up and got my blood pumping. And that made me start to think about, like, all right, is there a way to parlay this into something that you can make some money at? And I wouldn't have even known what a real estate developer was when I was 22, 23, but knew that the world of admissions was not my long term. It was great. It got me to travel the world and on someone else's dime, which was exciting, but that world of higher ed administration just wasn't my calling. But it gave me the time to sort of figure out what might come next. And because my education was more theoretical, I didn't have the background in finance to be able to write a pro forma and do a 10-year discounted cash flow and all that. So yeah, those first couple of years allowed me to realize that there is a world out there, but I had to go figure out how to parlay that into a real career. And that's where my graduate studies sort of helped that.
Well, I was going to make some bad joke about rowing, but we cruised right by the of rowing piece of the story, which I really, it's cool to know that you were an athlete and you were involved on that level as well. And we didn't necessarily talk about this previously, but I'm curious how much that, when I talk to athletes specifically, and I'm a little bit of a crazy athlete myself in the cycling world, in the endurance world. And so I know that there's sort of a mindset that comes with that type of activity where you want to quit. There are times when you want to quit consistently, and there are times when it's just easier to give up, right? And so how much do you feel like your endurance experience, your sport experience has impacted this early journey into figuring out this development world?
Oh, it's an interesting question. The endurance world, I don't know if that did it so much as the compulsion for others to not stop. I think endemically that's just kind of ingrained in me. I mean, I ran in high school as well, and that depletes your energy real quick too, even if you're a sprinter. So I think that was just always part of my upbringing in terms of my athletic pursuits. But I think that there is something to the idea of when I started coaching and having to help others realize that they can get past that moment where you want to say no, really maybe locked in a little bit more about how I can leverage that in whatever I do. Because it's one thing to find it in that kind of your gut and inside you. It's another to pull that out of someone else that doesn't want to do it and doesn't necessarily have that background and experience to do it. So coaching the novice rowing team was, I think, really instrumental in how to talk to people, how to motivate people, how to understand the challenges that pop up on an erg or on the water, or even just trying to get on the water. I mean, the number of logistical challenges that we face as rowers just getting on the water is sometimes mind-boggling.
Well, let's keep moving here. So, Curbed, you mentioned that earlier. We were kind of talking about how maybe that is is it co-urbanized now? I can't remember what the urbanized blog or what it turned into.
Urbanized now, or it's an offshoot that's become urbanized with different cities.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like it really started there as you were in sort of this educational higher ed setting.
Yeah.
What happened then? So some light bulbs were going off. You're realizing, here's what I don't necessarily want to do. Here's where I want to head. What was next? Did you jump into the real world right away, or what did that look like?
No, because I knew that I was going to have to go back to school in some way, most likely. I was, like many people during the Great Recession, I was considering business school because that sounds like a great thing to go make some money in B school. And while I pursued that, I was talking to other people, and they were like helping me realize my interest in the built environment, that there were other more specific ways to learn about that and get degrees in that. So while I was trying to get into business school at one of the most competitive times of the recent history, I was also concurrently thinking about this idea of city planning. And what I was calling back then, talking to one of my sociology professors who was really instrumental in figure out what city planning was, I was calling it social engineering, like this idea that you could influence and impact people's moving through the city and interacting with other people and community building just with placemaking. And with my 23, 24-year-old experience, I didn't quite know what that meant, but that idea that you could forge a path through a park with a cow path, and that could change the way that you think about landscape design. So that got me looking at city planning programs and realizing that that was a much more specific way to unlock my interest in big buildings and what's happening on the ground floor in retail and what might be happening in a community center and helping people just be part of a neighborhood. And that's kind of what led me to apply to those programs. And as I researched more and was admitted to those, that's what set me on that track, because I could get the business acumen and the finance at the same time as reading more theoretical ideas about physical city planning.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities. Brought to you by Authentic, delivering premier multifamily brand experiences and smart digital marketing. Authentic's proven approach accelerates leasing velocity, boosts rental rates, and increases long-term value. You can find out more at AuthenticFF.com. And by Charles Gate, the multifamily investor's secret weapon to help underwrite, go to market, and operate projects that generate market-beating returns. With an adaptive staffing model and on-demand leasing teams, Charles Gate empowers a better resident experience at an efficient cost structure for today's owners. Visit charlesgate.com for more. What is the program that you ended up in and what do you feel like that set you up for moving forward in terms of the moving from theory to, call it, hard data or however you want to kind of phrase that?
Yeah, I went out to the University of Pennsylvania and the city planning program there at the School of Design, and then did a certificate program through Wharton there, learning about the meat and potatoes of IRRs and debt coverages and all that stuff. But the pivot in that program was very practical. In city planning, there's typically a sort of, call it, theoretical or policy-based program. And then there's one that's very much based in physical planning, like what does the block look like? How do you add land use policies to that, just from a mapping standpoint? So the program at Penn is very specifically geared towards physical planning rather than the theoretical policy-based, which may take a long time to come to fruition. So there's a lot of value in that. I mean, that's why the great city here in Chicago happened. I mean, Daniel Burnham is the grandfather of all of that, and that's the sort of long game, but I was gravitating more towards the ability to impact things more quickly, and that idea of saying, okay, you take this open piece of land and you can build a big building and change that neighborhood. Seeing some of that in our projects even here at Tandem, that within a few years, the actual built environment can change versus the planning that might take a lot longer because someone doesn't pick up on those things that you're writing is seen 15, 20, 40 years. Speaking
of Chicago is it for you, it seems like. You find a way to thread in the Chicago theme, and I love that. There's something to be said for being a huge fan of a local community and of a city like Chicago. So when did you make your way back to Chicago? Did it take a while, or did you say, nope, I'm headed right back?
Yeah, as I kind of made my trek east to Chicago, and the world of the East Coast is always sort of this promised land to us on the West Coast. I think it's just so different that I wanted to at least get a stab at that. So that was one of the reasons why I looked at a lot of programs on the East Coast. Went out to Philadelphia, enjoyed my time there. It's a great city, but I think going from something as large and vibrant as Chicago and then spending time in Philly, which is sometimes viewed as a little smaller, it didn't resonate with me quite the same way. I loved being there, and I go back and enjoy the city. But within I think a first year and a half, it felt like this was not home, and that the Midwest and Chicago really was pull me back at some point. So I stayed for about a year and a half, 2 years after finishing my program. Worked for a great sole proprietor who was able to do some really cool projects out in the Philadelphia suburbs, but cut my teeth there, but promptly went back to the place that will probably be, at least in my heart of hearts, home for a long time.
Well, let's talk about Tandem. When you joined Tandem, you told me it was in a very different place, different stage of company growth. Set the stage for that time period,
Sure.
what Tandem was about then, and then we can kind of transition to really the evolution of Tandem and your involvement in the group.
Yeah, so I came back because I wanted to be in Chicago so badly. I left without a job, which is a scary thing. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it or not recommend it, but I came back knowing that I wanted to find the right place that was going to let me do the things that I was interested in long term and with good people. And so I happened upon Tandem through some mutual contacts that we had both had. And Tandem at that point had been doing some small scale multifamily, but more in the luxury single family house space across the north side of the city and the north side of the North Shore of Chicago. Had made a pretty good name for itself over its sort of short tenure, call it 15 years from the founding of that. But the bread and butter was the high-end single-family house world. But the partners and founders here had always had visions of kind of growing that beyond that, and the world of the multifamily market in that kind of, call it 2012, 2013, was starting to perk up a little bit again. And when I came into the organization, there were desires to sort of unlock that potential on the development and construction side that had always been there, but the capital markets just allowed for it in that way. So I was brought in to sort of think about zoning and putting together pro formas and the financing information and packages necessary to talk to banks and investors and project managers at a scale of 50, 100, or 150 plus units. So that was where we hadn't gotten to that point yet when I came back in 2012.
That must have been a huge shift from higher ed world, and kind of hitting the ground running with Tandem early on, I have to imagine was thrilling and exciting, and I don't know, I have to imagine there was some moments where you felt like, what did I get myself into? I'm barely treading the water here. I have to imagine that learning curve was quite sharp early on.
It was, and we're coming from a large institution of, call it 15,000 students and another 10, 15,000 employees through the hospitals and the actual educational faculty, where there's an infrastructure and there's all of these processes and there's a way it's been doing for 100 plus years, to come to a much more entrepreneurial environment where there is no guidebook. You're figuring it out day to day, and you've got to show your mettle every single day. Was not something I was necessarily looking for, but I think I've thrived in and have enjoyed that it's not laid out, and every day is a little bit different, and thrown new challenges every day, and you're in the trenches with your team figuring out how to make the best of those situations. And that's continues even to this day. I mean, even though we've found a lot of success over the last decade and have done a lot of great projects, we're still doing that. I mean, we're still a small and scrappy team overall. We've got a core group of amazing people that are able to pull it all together. But even today, we still consider ourselves a very entrepreneurial, opportunity-led development.
So your role has really evolved over the years, and I think one of the hallmarks of what you told me your role sort of encompasses today is this idea of kind of the front end legwork and doing some research and providing guidance to the team on site selection, the right markets, and so forth. How would you sort of classify and explain what your role is today? And obviously in entrepreneurial environment,
Yeah.
you're probably going to say I do a little bit of everything. But how would you sort of frame that in, call it 2024, 2025?
Yeah, in 24, 25, I think I'm more of the generalist that helps bridge all the different teams together to take what I've learned here at Tandem the last decade and have them execute, and me be a little bit broader in terms of not getting in the weeds on everything. In the projects 10 years ago, I mean, we all had to just get in and do the work. And now we have a little bit more depth and a little bit more formalization of our processes and how we approach that I can use my background and experience and how we did things before to chart people on paths to do that more efficiently and do it better than I was able to. Where, again, generalist, we're kind of, I say I do the full life cycle of the building, from the vacant piece of land all the way to dispositions and everything in between. But I'm not a professional, and I don't have 20 years of experience in each one of those, but there are others that do, that I can help bridge those conversations to hopefully make 1 + 1 = those.
Yeah. One of the things that we had the opportunity to chat about briefly was this idea of the second mountain. And it's something that I don't bring up often, but I do bring it up with select people that I feel like are sort of at that moment in their careers and in their lives, or approaching that moment. And it's this idea that, the first mountain's very much about ourselves. It's very egocentric, and it's kind of just like figuring out our place in the world and really going after it and getting after it. And then there comes a point where fulfillment is really more about, how can I help others? How can I give back? How can I, help my company progress, but maybe in a different way? So I'm curious, for you and your work, what is driving you these days? Is it the same as it was in your early to mid 20s, or has it changed?
I think a lot of the stuff that got me out of bed and drove me 10 years ago is still there. I wouldn't say that it's gone. I mean, I still love the blank canvas of a new site that can be rezoned and build a new building or a new office building. But I think that it's coupled now with the realization that I'm not the only person that can and wants to do that. And not that I thought that before, but realizing that the same excitement that I had and have for that is shared by others, and realizing that they're on a journey towards that too, and imparting some of that information and experience has been really fulfilling as our team has grown and as we've kept the band together, if you will, and being able to build on something that isn't people churning through leaving. So there's something in that longevity of the team, and being able to say, oh, okay, I did that in XYZ project, you're seeing that now. There's a lot of personal fulfillment in that, and figuring out ways to share that with them. And as a result, you're sharing in that achievement too. You just might not be.
Well, let's get a little bit deeper into the weeds there, because it's always fun to talk with a development mind in a different market than I'm familiar with. And, obviously I'm in Colorado, so I've been in and around the Denver market for the better part of 2 decades at this point. For you in Chicago, tell me about the challenges that the city is facing these days, barriers to new developments, issues around the community, just things that you're facing in the environmental impact that you've seen over the years and how it's been changing.
Yeah, I mean, Chicago has a lot of baggage. It's a great city, but there's still a lot of headwinds that a lot of people have as developers, most notably taxes. The tax situation here has been kind of ruminating for the last 5-7 years. That really has made it a challenge. We're doing our best to navigate that, but it's made it such that we're not always pursuing as many projects here in where we're based as we may have 5-8 years ago. I think there is some clarity that's coming into that may abate that challenge. The world of affordable housing is something that people are worried about and working through across the country. Chicago is no exception to that, but I think some of the ways that we're trying to execute on that improvement of being a housing provider, and I think there's something interesting about thinking about real estate developers as housing providers and not developers, And I think that the housing providers in this city have a desire to provide a habitable, quality place to live, but the ways that that's showing itself in policy and development has been really difficult over the last 3 to 5 years. I was lucky enough to be on the Mayor's Task Force for Affordable Housing a few years back, coming out of the pandemic, and some of the work that we were doing there was really, I think, encouraging on where that might be able to be a partner both in the private and the public sector. And some of that has just kind of all fallen by the wayside as the administrations have sort of changed. So obviously taxes are a big one, affordable housing, the sort of world of crime has been, I think, perhaps overblown in the media, but it's created some kind of capital markets redlining of Chicago that's had us looking to other markets as well to sort of find chasing of yield. As sort of horrible as that sounds as a planner, I always say I'm a developer with a heart, but at the end of the day, the money is what drives our ability to subsist, and capital is looking for the most return for the least amount of risk. And Chicago, up until probably I would say 18 months ago, was one of the tougher markets for that. Again, I think it's abating here as we enter into 2025. Those are some of the things that here at Tandem we've been ruminating about.
Speaking about ruminations, you had some really great ideas that I would love to get your take on the recording here around what you're looking forward to next, or maybe what you're sort of sifting through, flipping through as a group at Tandem as you look ahead to the next few years. Obviously, the last year, 18 months has been pretty choppy, as you alluded to. Sure. But in terms of things that you're keeping your eye on, either you personally or the group as a whole, what comes to mind? And I'm leading the question here a little bit because I know you have some good answers, so let's get into it.
Yeah, no, I loved this question. I love this question. I think the meatiest thing on my mind as a multifamily developer is like what it is that we're providing from a product standpoint. I'm kind of a product junkie and comp junkie, and wanting to make sure that we're providing the most in the most efficient way possible from a construction standpoint, but also meeting what the market is wanting. And the world of work from home has really, I won't say upended the multifamily market, but I think that we as the multifamily developer are becoming more and more like an office developer in some ways, because now more and more people are working from home. And we've known that trend since the day that we all got the orders to stay at home, but I think it's showing itself in the built environment long term, and we are having to program work from home space both in units and in the actual units themselves, and thinking about how that plays out long term, and how the office world has probably morphed fundamentally for a lot of our future lifetimes, and understanding how we bear that and reconcile the costs necessary to do that and still make our pro formas work is something that we've been thinking about in our most recent projects as far back as Sage West Loop. It's happening in our projects that we're thinking about in Tampa right now, and it'll continue to be ones whether they're here in Chicago or other southern markets.
Not to put you on the spot, but when we think about like this home office nook, or like the work from home lounges and stuff like that, do you think that's here to stay, or do you think that that's something that's a passing fad? We don't have to say this is your answer forever. Obviously things change, but
No.
In terms of what you're seeing out in the market, what's your take?
I think it is here to stay in some form. I don't know if it will always be as large as it feels right now. I do think that people have a desire to be around other people, and as flexible and nice as it is to be able to, for us even to have this conversation through a screen, will abate more and more. And I know the data's not showing that. Well, if you look at the Castle data, the numbers aren't ticking as much month to month as maybe people would expect as people like Amazon go back to the office. But I do think that more and more companies will realize that they're losing some of the softer skills and the non-quantifiable things as they get through a couple cycles of employees that you can't train and you can't bring up your talent the same way through a screen. Maybe I'm a traditionalist in that sense. So I do think it is around to stay, though. I mean, whether it shows itself the same way when we program a little nook or a mini office within an apartment, those areas will still have value. It may not have the same premium in 15, 20 years, but having a little offshoot in a space for a crib or a storage room or a place to just throw all of your junk when you get into the apartment. There will be a need for that, even if there are fewer people who have their 5-foot desk set up in their unit.
Yeah. And then the second one that you brought up to me, and I know I'm leading you here, but I want to hear your thoughts on this, is this idea of moving through this season where there's been what has felt like this unlimited demand for new Class A apartment buildings, luxury this, luxury that. Quite the buzzword over the last few years in multifamily. What do you think? Is that here to stay? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, we often banter about that idea here in our office that there was this moment in the kind of, call it the post-war era, the boom of American kind of exceptionalism that kind of had the American dream of the for sale home that I think has been inverted here over the last 10, 15 years. And the pandemic, I think, is probably exacerbated even more with the way that interest rate world has made it more and more difficult just to attain that idea of home ownership. And I don't necessarily view that as a horrible thing. I mean, I'm incentivized as a multifamily developer to be encouraged that multifamily continues to show strength. But I think there's been a fundamental shift in what people, one, are able to do with student loans and with just the price of housing, and what people want. As someone who's a renter by choice, I think more and more people realize that that idea of the homestead is not necessarily for everyone, and that there's a lot of value in what a dense urban environment in a rented building can offer. So we think that we might be in the kind of early innings of the 9-inning game, if you will, and maybe there's extra innings too. I don't know that everyone thought the cycle of the for sale world was going to run for those 40, 50, 60 years that it did. And if we talk about that idea of the Class A rental where the millennials and the Gen Zs and the alphas of the world don't want to mow their lawn and they don't want to repair. I mean, some of us don't know how to repair the broken sink or the broken toilet the way that previous generations. So there's a little bit of a generational mentality there too, that the for rental Class A world might just kind of be getting started, and the filtering effect of those Class A from 10 years ago will be the Class B that still offers a lot of those same opportunities for housing people. That is very different than the typical suburban greenfield development seen in the, call it, 90s.
What else? As we start to wrap up here, I'm curious, anything else come to mind for you that you're like, we're definitely keeping an eye on that because that's interesting, that could move the needle, maybe not yet, keeping an eye on it?
We're investigating a lot of new ways to finance projects. I think the world of HUD is an interesting world that we're spending a lot of time looking at. The world of opportunity zones and what that means in certain locations is something that we spend a fair amount of time talking about. Those, I won't necessarily call them incentive-based programs, but again, that policy that's driving the development patterns. I think that role will probably continue to grow, especially as the capital markets are kind of stuck right now where it doesn't make sense to pull the trigger on some of those projects. The government has a sort of mandate in HUD to sort of open that up. So we're thinking about how to leverage that and make projects work in a way that maybe wasn't typical in the past. And we're a typical long holder of real estate, so the merchant builder mentality doesn't often look at that. So we're maybe ideally suited to think about those two worlds a little bit more as well.
Cool. Well, I love to ask this last question. It's something that, to me, I always sort of run over to my Amazon book list and usually add an additional book, I don't know when I'm gonna have time to read all these books, but
Yeah.
for you, Jeff, tell me, what is one book that you would recommend to the listeners today for one reason or another? Hit us with the title and what it's all about.
Yeah, the Modern Management Mentor has been something that has been particularly interesting to me over the last, call it 16 months. It's written by Christine Sandman Stone, going back to that idea of like how to give back, or how you're sort of nurturing your team. It gives a lot of practical, real world experience on how to bring that to the fore in your daily experience in your job. And it's just written in a very accessible way that makes it one of those business books that's actually usable, where a lot of them, they end up on your shelf and you read them, but you don't necessarily know how to actually bring it into practice. Christine makes that really easy to do.
Awesome.
That's one that I'll offer up to the people out there.
Awesome. We will add that to the show notes. So if you're curious, go ahead and find that link in the show notes. Head right over there and grab that book. Jeff, it has been a pleasure hearing from you, your story, what Tandem is up to today, where you're looking to next. Only one more thing to do here. That's to roll out the red carpet for you and tell us where we can find you online and connect with you if we want to reach out.
Yeah, sure. So Tandem is our organization here. We're at tandeminc.net. That's where you can contact me or any of the other team members here. I'm on LinkedIn, Jeff Hreben. The show notes will have the spelling of my crazy last name. Happy to connect with anyone out there that's thinking about some of these things, or if it sparked any other ideas. But thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you, Jeff, for your time.